Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dr. Vicki Nash, who is the director of the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford. Her research interests draw on her background as a political theorist and concern the policy implications of children's use of internet technologies. Vicki Nash, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you so much for having me, John.
The conversation I'd like to have with you today, Vicki, will cover the Oxford Internet Institute and internet governance and regulation related to children. How about we start with the bottom line? Why is it important to study technology in children?
Gosh, I could give you so many reasons here, but maybe let's just cover a couple. So the first is that children are, by their age, by their developmental stage, usually more vulnerable users of digital technologies. And so we might want to know how those vulnerabilities manifest themselves and what types of risks or harms they might experience in relation to their internet use. Importantly, of course, they also succeed in using the internet in ways that will benefit them immensely. So when I think about that sort of research, what I really want to do is understand how children use digital technologies for good or for ill. But the second reason I think it's also really important to study this is that we obviously need to recognize, I guess this is probably particularly important for your audience, that today's children as internet users are tomorrow's adult internet users. And so if we're thinking about whether it be security practices, online technical abilities, skills, confidence, this starts with children. And so, really, this is why we need to understand how they use the technology, where the differences lie, and what we could be doing to ensure well-being and positive social outcomes for all.
Right. It sounds a little bit like a silly trope, but you can make the very serious argument that children are, in fact, the very most important people on the planet, because they're the ones that are going to be inheriting the world that is evolving around us right now. Would you say that that's about right?
I think that's true, but also just to put it, to put it in context, there was a Unicef report, I think a couple of years ago now, conducting research on children, digital citizens, digital children around the world. And one of the figures in that report that really surprised me was that actually 1 in 3 internet users are under the age of 18. So it's not just that they are that they're vulnerable, that there are risks, that there are harms. These really are tomorrow's internet users. And if we think about the types of behavior, the types of activities we want to build, we really do need to be looking at this group now and really understanding what drives them, really understanding how they engage with these technologies. So yeah, I think it's not a trope. I think it's actually really worthwhile focusing on.
For sure. So you just mentioned a fact about internet usage. Are there any other noteworthy, relevant facts and figures related to children and internet technology that you could share that maybe help either set the scene or illuminate the kinds of things that you and your colleagues are working on and are concerned with?
Sure. It's always easy to give statistics, I guess, in a particular national context, because obviously, things vary by, sociodemographic composition of a population, level of technological adoption, etc. So if I maybe just stick with something like the UK, which I think is not so dissimilar, say, from the US, we have an annual media survey of children's attitudes and uses that comes out, produced by our regulator each year. And one of the statistics that really struck me in last year's report was that if you look at 8 to 11-year-olds, 64% of those are using social media, and importantly, 60% of them have their own social media profile, right? So that's nearly 2/3 of 8 to 11-year-olds. Now, what's interesting about that to me is that, technically the minimum age for having a social media profile is 13. So two things I draw from that. One is that, for younger children especially, so under 13-year-olds, large numbers of them are just regularly using sites that just weren't designed for them, potentially with, sort of like the content or affordances that might be a bit inappropriate. And the second is, and I don't have the statistic to hand on this, but I know there's been some quite nice research done. Of those 60%, I think quite a large proportion will have been helped probably by their parents, actually, to set up those social media accounts. So there will have been a degree of either, complicit help, or sort of quiet approval, or obviously in some cases disobedience. So I think, there are many other stats that I can give you, but I just think, from the perspective of this podcast, that's a really interesting one, that from an early age, our children are doing things online that technically and even legally they're not really allowed to do. And perhaps even their parents are sort of agreeing that they should be able to do it.
Not to get too far down that rabbit hole, but why do you think that is? Why do you think that many parents, I guess, are complicit or enable or I don't know whether it's actually breaking the law, but allow their children to have these social media accounts when they're not of the age required yet?
So this is where I think it gets really interesting. And I realize that so the introduction I suppose I've given makes it sound as if I think all this is a really terrible phenomenon and we should all be up in arms about it. I think the reason that so many children do this is because, these activities, they are fun, they are rewarding. It enables them to communicate with their friends, to express themselves, to develop their identity. And I think many parents, do this if they are helping, again, with the best will in the world. I've done it myself as a parent. You look at your child, everybody else is on these sites, you can see what fun things, it enables. And so, I think it goes back to this point about how do we balance these risks and opportunities in an appropriate way for different age groups. There are social benefits, there are social pressures to being on these sorts of sites. But it's not clear to me that the answer simply would be to make it completely impossible for any child ever, to join up. I think this is a really sort of interesting grey area about how we manage children's ability to access sites, platforms, activities that aren't really built for them, which may bring them lots of opportunities, but may also bring lots of risks.
Yeah, and there does seem to me to be some kind of a innate or unavoidable tension between technological advancements and people's engagement with the technology. I mean, and not just necessarily for children, but even adults, right? And I'm sure that the conversation that we're having right now, Vicki, you could probably rewind 70 years, and there were probably thoughtful people having the exact same conversation about radio or the exact same conversation about television. Do you think that there's something to that there is just like a inherent tension there?
I do, and people worried about the advent of the novel in the 1700s, for example. People would spend all their time reading fiction.
Is that right? That is a legitimate historical finding.
Put it this way, it's one I've certainly seen repeated enough. I ought to check my sources.
Okay. Fair enough. Yeah.
You certainly do see this, yes, in relation to radio, definitely. Television, obviously, lots of worries about things like the watershed. So we've definitely seen it in other communication technologies, even if we discard my novel example. And I think that there are a couple of angles to this. I suppose one is that there is often a moral panic of some sort that surrounds the advent of new technologies, because it makes things visible or possible, often maybe at a scale or a speed that didn't seem possible before. I mean, it's hard to remember that that radio did do that, for example, TV did do that. So yes, our initial response is to get very worried, I suppose. The second, though, is I also think that it's useful to remind ourselves of this, because I think we might be able to learn how to sort of respond to these risks and challenges. So an example would be, if I think about the concerns I've just raised with you about children on social media, to me, actually, the response is not, well, let's ban them, let's get them all off. It would be, well, let's do some research. Let's try and understand about, what the balance of risks and opportunities is to particular children, and then maybe think about an intervention. Because, if I look at TV, if I look at radio, it's not clear that the world fell apart when we introduced those technologies. So I think we should be, do the same in this context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, maybe we can start stepping into some of your areas of research. So what are some of the major policy considerations related to children in technology? And also, it might be helpful to quickly sketch out who are the key stakeholders in this space. I suspect it's not just children.
Right. No, and in fact, often enough, it's not even children. So we might certainly think about whether they are involved enough in these discussions. The classic stakeholders we talk about a lot, I suppose, are sort of fourfold. So obviously governments, insofar as they are, making regulatory frameworks that shape children's use of or access to technologies. The second, I suppose, would be schools. So often they're the intervening body, delivering education, delivering training, maybe themselves conducting some sort of surveillance or monitoring of children for safety purposes. Parents, obviously, as in other areas of child rearing, we tend to think that certain responsibilities accrue to parents in terms of keeping their children's well-being in mind. And then, yes, I would say last but not least, very much not least, children themselves. Very often their voices, I think, are left out of these debates about what policies should look like, what types of interventions are effective, and that is very unfortunate. To go back to your question about what are the major policy considerations, I think there are a few different angles on this. So one that is worth flagging up, because actually we don't tend to think about this as much, but I think for me it was highlighted by the pandemic, and that's access. So I think looking at this from a US perspective, a UK perspective, there's a tendency for me to think that, we've got 100% penetration of digital technologies. Everybody's got a smartphone, everybody's got a laptop. And it's not the case. So we shouldn't forget about access, and access for children for the purposes of education and social connection, I think is really key. And I don't know what it's like in the US, but when everything went online here during the pandemic, there was this huge realization that you did have large groups of school children who did not have access to a device they could use for their remote education. So, let alone the ability to forward the data. So that's one area, is access to technology. The second, I think, is very much around safety and well-being. And this is a really fraught area. So, I think you're being a little bit more restrained in the US. In the UK, we've had a big debate over the last 5 years as to what responsibilities the government has to regulate tech companies to keep children safe online. And we've currently got an act going through Parliament at the moment, the Online Safety Bill. And I guess there the focus really is around, what risks can companies expose children to? And that raises questions in the first place of, do companies know which of their users are children? And then B, what responsibilities do they bear towards those users? If they think they are children, they're things they shouldn't see or shouldn't be allowed to do. Arising from that, and I think it's worth just treating this as a separate policy issue, but it does sort of follow from the previous one. There is this question around, who should be allowed to do what at what age? And that comes up in two contexts. So one in terms of online safety. And there, I think, the onus increasingly is going to be on platforms, particularly in the UK, to verify a user's age, which has all sorts of security and privacy considerations. And how often do they have to do that? Every time they access a website, every time they access a new tool, or is it a one-off process? And the flip side of that is we worry about kids being gated out of the internet. If everything, is suddenly only accessible to those over 18 or over 16, what happens to all the kids who've been using it up till now? And then I suppose the last one I think I'd flag is really around privacy and data protection. Some of the things I've been working on the last couple of years have been around the uses of children's data, and in particular the sort of growing normalization of digital surveillance that we see in schools, in homes, all around us. So whether that be IoT devices, Internet of Things devices in the home, smart assistants, baby tech, whether it be the use of digital platforms in schools, collecting data about behavior and performance, or whether it be, so the idea of sort of growing digital caseloads that exist on sort of children, at the state level. So yeah, for me, those would be the four main areas, I think.
My goodness. Well, so many different potential follow-ups here. Just a couple that come to mind for me is uh, I'm not sure whether this is just a United States thing or whether it's more generalizable, but movies, right? Movies have a system of grading. PG for parental guidance. PG-13 for children under the age of 13 or caution. And then R and rated X. Stuff like that. So video games, I think, and apps like in the Apple store, or I'm sure in the Google store as well. I'm less familiar with that, but I'm sure I think apps also have like age ratings and things like that. So that's one thing I'd like for you to maybe comment about a little bit. Is like, is there some kind of a developing way of assessing things that are and are not appropriate for children? That's number one. And then number two, we had a discussion uh, a while back now with the former president of Estonia, a gentleman named Mr. Toomas Hendrik Ilves. Anyway, he described, and I'm not going to get it all just right, but Estonia has a national ID card system for all citizens. Is having some kind of like a ID, or a digital identification system needed in order to help manage the kinds of things that you and your colleagues are grappling with. But take all of that in whatever direction you think is productive.
Wow, there's two big questions there. Okay, so let's start with the first one. So are we seeing the development of sort of measures to age gate the internet, or as you say, rating systems, for example, that might be a starting point? I suppose we already have that to some degree, at the very least, just thinking about existing legislation. So in the US, for example, around data protection, I think it was at the age of 13, was the age whereby children below that couldn't consent to having their data processed. That affected the type of services that could be offered to children without parental consent. In Europe, we've actually allowed countries to set their own age for that. So in some countries it's 16, some 13, some 14. Equally, we have content, and I presume you do too, which, for example, is only accessible if you can prove you're an adult, particularly in the UK context, things like pornography, for example. So we do already have that. I would say we're probably not yet there in developing more finely grained age ratings. You do see them arising, I suppose, in an informal sense. If you use something like, YouTube Kids, that is a designed walled garden effectively for kids, below a certain age. But yeah, no, we don't have, I don't think, anything quite equivalent to the movie rating or the game rating approach yet. But one thing I suppose I would flag that I think is different in that context is if you think about, well, maybe you didn't, maybe you were very law-abiding and rule-abiding as a child, but I certainly saw movies, that were rated sort of rated 15 when I was 13, and I sometimes did that with my parents' knowledge and consent. They thought that was okay, that I was mature enough to handle it. I think the difficulty in the difference in the online context, certainly in the UK, it seems to me there's a risk that we're going to be imposing these sort of age verification requirements in a much harder way. So it's the equivalent of me trying to go to a cinema and see a 15 rated film and somebody saying, unless I see your passport to prove you're over 15, you can't come in. And I think there is something about digital technologies that maybe makes that a bit easier. Perhaps, you don't have to just produce a daft paper copy. So that's one area where I'm a little bit more worried about the potential of these ratings if we introduce them. On the one hand, it gives you extra sort of certainty that the content or the activities may be age appropriate. On the other hand, it does remove the potential for sort of parental discretion or, some kids more mature, some kids less mature. The second question about digital identity systems. Now, I don't think this is necessary, certainly. And one of the things that I've been quite interested in the last few years has been the development of age verification technologies or age assurance technologies, which don't require you to prove who you are. So an example would be you now can get systems, for example, which would make an age assessment based on my image now in this shot. And actually, Some of those are frighteningly accurate. Equally, there are others which enable you to access, sort of tokens, if you like. So prove once and then never have to prove your identity again. It really generates a token that websites can use, and it merely says, to the original site, is this person, say, age 13 or whatever. So I suppose that's the answer I would give, is that I don't think we need to link age and identity in the same way for these types of systems to work.
Right. Yeah. So developing other ways which are using like real-time data, like online activity data that can help validate someone's age, based on that live behavior, would be something that you would find more preferable. But so there's technology that is presumably being developed that is aimed at this kind of a problem and solution.
Very definitely. So in the UK, we have an age verification providers association. They have a variety of companies that they represent, but I know there's one that gets mentioned again and again, a company called Yoti, who specialize in this sort of age-based age assessment using images, using photographs of faces, etc. And I suppose, to me, the advantage of this type of system is worth spelling out, because I suppose I mentioned before that point about privacy. I think it's really important that we don't track our children across the internet in a way that creates a lasting digital record of everything they do, say up to the age of 18. So finding, if age assurance or age checks are going to be necessary, finding ways of doing it that are privacy protecting, I think, is really, really important.
Right. And, Vicki, you and I were connected by our mutual friend, Tom Sear. And I'll put a link to Tom's episode in the show notes as well. But Tom, the topic of the conversation with Tom was an article that he wrote a couple of years ago, but it paints a scenario, I think, that you would appreciate, where a special operations soldier is pursuing some kind of a mission, right? But the adversary has a decade or more of historical behavior captured from when this special operator was a child. And they are making inferences and predictions, and are using that historical data to influence this person's activities while on the operation. And I think this is the kind of thing that you were just sketching out. If data are allowed to be collected on children, then ultimately that data can be used for various different purposes. Some could be perfectly good, like, I don't know, better healthcare, but some could be used for very worrisome purposes. Would you agree with all that?
I definitely would agree with all that. And I think, again, one of the problems specifically with data being collected about children, particularly very young children, is that, they're just not in a position to consent to that or understand the full implications of it. I mean, I'm not even sure that as adults we are. But yeah, so it definitely feels to me as if, prioritizing children's privacy on their behalf is really important.
This has been a brief introduction to this huge and important topic, Vicki. So thank you so much. I'd like to ask you about the Oxford Internet Institute itself. So what are some of the other major projects and initiatives that you and your colleagues have going on?
Oh, that's such a good question. I could talk for hours and hours on this. So the OII, as we call it, because Oxford Internet Institute is just such a mouthful, the OII is a really unusual model for an academic department. We are multidisciplinary in a really extreme way. So I'm a social scientist and political theorist, but I work alongside sociologists, geographers, lawyers, many people across the social sciences, but also computer scientists, physicists, historians, and philosophers. And the reason that array of expertise is so important is because it gives us the sort of the tool sets that you need to sort of to drill down on some of these really important questions about what the implications are of digital technologies in modern society. So to give you some examples of the other areas in which these other colleagues from other backgrounds are working. One major one right now is looking obviously at the the sort of the ethical questions and the governance questions around artificial intelligence, and in particular how artificial intelligence is used to make decisions about us that really affect us in certain key ways. So I have colleagues like Sandra Wachter, who's a lawyer, working alongside Brent Mittelstadt, who's a philosopher, basically generating recommendations for companies, when it has been taken up by these companies, so companies like Amazon, as to what types of explanation they have to give us when they make decisions on our behalf, right? So this is the idea of, we would say, the right to reasonable algorithmic inferences. So, in other words, why are algorithms making the decisions, and what could we do to ensure that maybe those decisions would come out a different way? So if you think about, if you applied for a mortgage and the computer said no, what would you have had to done differently to get a yes? So that's one really interesting area. Another is looking at the future of work in an area of what we might call the gig economy, or new forms of digital labor. So really big international project, something called the Fair Work Project, and it's trying to identify key principles for companies that want to use gig workers, that they might employ from any country anywhere in the world. So that would include, on the one hand, companies like Uber and Deliveroo, where I'm buying a meal, buying a service in my country, and those individuals should be employed according to the labour laws of my country. Or it might include me buying, remote marketing services or editing services from individuals, literally on the other side of the world. So the Fair Work Project is a really great project that tries to understand a bit more about how any of us that use those digital services can do so ethically, and what types of information companies should provide to ensure that they are behaving ethically. So those are a couple of areas. We also do quite a lot of research on digital government and innovation, information security. There's a whole strand of work, not just me working in the area of sort of children and well-being and education. And we also, as I said, we have colleagues on the sort of philosophy side, and then on the hardcore science side. And on the latter, we've been advancing something we call social data science. So this is the idea of doing large-scale data analysis on these big data sets, but particularly pertaining to people's social data. So social media data, your online digital footprint, your transactions, etc. So yeah, it covers a huge array. Very happy to talk about more of those in any depth if you wish.
Wow. Yeah. No. What a sprawling scope of inquiry there. It all sounds very very worthwhile, and would love to have any of your other colleagues on that are can talk about any one of those strands. So would like to ask you. I try to ask most guess this, Vicki, do you have a research question that a interested student might pick up and examine during the course of a master's thesis or a PhD thesis, that kind of thing?
Sure. So it's difficult in the sense that I think there are such a huge array of questions, and often the main barrier to answering them is actually access to data. But I guess one area where I really feel we need to do more research would be around the benefits of digital technology use for children and young people. So I think there's quite a lot that's done on the risks and the harms, but for me that needs to be balanced by research questions that would try and understand, for example, what are the benefits, maybe not from an education perspective, but maybe in terms of, say, you're forming your own identity, developing your own sense of personality, developing a sense of self-efficacy. So any questions that would find ways of working with children, perhaps qualitatively, so maybe small scale interviews or ethnographies, or maybe if we could ever get access to some of those big corporate data sets that obviously are held on many of us. But yeah, what are the beneficial what are the benefits of these digital technologies for children and young people?
Wow, interesting direction. I did not foresee you putting a question out there like that, but yeah, it's very relevant. And then finally, what is a good book or maybe an online resource that you can suggest that an interested listener could check out if they want a deeper dive into any of these topics?
Okay, am I allowed to recommend two?
Yes, you are.
We've covered a couple of different things. All right.
100%. Yeah.
Thank you. So one that I've really liked in relation to this discussion about children's use of digital technologies, it's quite old now, insofar as an internet time, anything before about 2020 now seems old. But it's a book by a lady called Dana Boyd, and it's called It's Complicated, The Social Lives of Network Teens. And the reason I like it is because it really goes beyond, what we've discussed, this idea of some moral panic around new technologies. It goes beyond that to really work with children to understand, how are they using social media? How do they think about privacy online? Is that bullying? Is that drama? So it goes through a whole variety of these topics and really tries to understand them from a teenager's perspective. And I just love the fact that her conclusion is it's complicated. And I think that it gets us away from these very easy answers about, the internet's fundamentally harmful and risky for young people. So that's one. And then for the second, I'm going to do a shameless plug for a colleague's new book, which, if you like, I think is quite an interesting take on some of these bigger questions about how you govern tech companies, how you regulate the internet. And this is a book called Cloud Empires. It's by my colleague Villy Leidonvirta. And it looks at sort of these big tech companies, and it's almost asking the question of, are these actually now, are these companies the big nation states? Are they bigger than nation states? Is this why they're so hard to regulate? How do they set rules? How do they set laws? How do they challenge governments? And so, yeah, if you like, so that to me, I think, sums up quite nicely why this whole area is so difficult to manage, that we are up against these big companies with huge power to bring benefits, to bring risks, but are very hard to regulate. So yeah, those would be my two.
Excellent suggestions. We will have links to those book recommendations plus the other items that Vicki mentioned during the discussion. And with that, Vicki Nash, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
John, it's been a huge pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me on.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.